Well, meanwhile, the World Food Programme is struggling to raise funding for drought victims in several African countries. Despite urgent appeals by the United Nations, there is a massive funding shortfall. Tens of millions of people in Ethiopia, Nigeria, South Sudan and Somalia are in desperate need of food assistance. Our UN correspondent Liling Tan has the latest.
These are some of the worst humanitarian crises the world is facing, and where the UN's World Food Programme is struggling to meet urgent food and nutrition needs. The UN estimated that some 20 million people across Nigeria, South Sudan, Somalia and Yemen are living in areas hit by drought and at risk of famine. We know that South Sudan, where civil war rages, pockets of famine have already been declared in parts of the country. There, the World Food Programme assessed that nearly 5 million people are currently in need of help, with 100,000 people facing famine conditions. In Ethiopia, 4.7 million people are in need of emergency food aid as the effects of last year's drought continue to batter families. Over the next 5 months alone, the World Food Programme requires $93 million for Ethiopia, nearly $243 million for Somalia, about $44 million for Kenya. But these targets have become increasingly difficult to meet with wide funding gaps. For example, the UN had appealed for $4.4 billion by the end of March to help people facing starvation in South Sudan, Nigeria, Somalia and Yemen, but had only received less than a quarter of that target. The problem, according to UN Chief Antonio Guterres, isn't so much about humanitarian fatigue in a time of multiple crises, rather than how the level of need has far outpaced resources. Liling Tan, CGTN, New York.
Well, let's bring you a closer look now at the impact this famine is having on Nigeria in particular. We're joined by Deji Badmus live in Lagos. Deji, of course, we know that Nigeria is one of the worst affected countries, but just tell us more about those people that are most vulnerable and the areas that are most affected.
Well, there are basically two areas of needs for Nigeria at the moment. The first and urgent need is to get food supplies to people in the northeast of the country, which of course is what the United Nations is trying to do, and the government too has actually been doing that on its own as well. I mean, even though its effort has not gone far enough to take care of everyone. But the most urgent need now is to get food supplies to the millions of people who are displaced, especially people in the very remote areas in Borno State. And I'm talking about places like Banki, very far away, places that are not easily accessible. And then the other need, which of course would be for the long term, is to get the people to rebuild their homes, to get them resettled in their communities, and perhaps most importantly, to get them back to farming, which is what the Food and Agriculture Organization has been trying to do. I mean, to get people back to farm so that they'll be able to provide for themselves. Because, I mean, for how long anyway would you be able to continue to provide food supplies for those people? So the whole essence is to get them back to farm so that they'll be able to provide for themselves. And that is what the Food and Agriculture Organization is trying to raise funds for. And of course, the Nigerian government too is trying its best to resettle these people who have been displaced back to their communities so that they can resume their normal lives of farming.
Well, it is indeed encouraging to hear of a response that involves not only the short-term need, but of course the long-term solutions that relate to the land. Thanks very much, Deji Badmus, speaking to us there from Lagos.